The last subject I would like to address when it comes to player setup is the question of player firmware updates. We get a lot of questions about how to update player firmware and when player firmware updates are required. So let me touch on those topics and show how best to update a player's firmware, and that should complete this section. The general rule of thumb regarding player firmware updates is simply this: player firmware must be updated when a new version of BrightAuthor is used. When versions of BrightAuthor roll forward, they expose new capabilities and new features for the overall BrightSign system. And in order to carry those new features and capabilities through to the player, a new minimum firmware version generally accompanies each new BrightAuthor version. So when you update BrightAuthor, you need to update the firmware in your players. However, if you're not updating BrightAuthor, if you're going to pick a version of BrightAuthor and run with it, simply stay with that version of firmware and operate your network. Just because we release a new version of firmware does not automatically suggest that there's a requirement to update the firmware in your players. Further, we do not force firmware updates into players without your knowledge. It's always the responsibility of the customer or the operator of the BrightSign network to choose when and what version of firmware to apply to a BrightSign player. The upgrade rule regarding old projects is, similarly, old BrightAuthor projects will run fine on new player firmware. So for example, imagine that I've got a network of players up and running with dozens of projects scheduled and all kinds of work has been accomplished, and now I've decided I need to update BrightAuthor and therefore update the firmware in my players. What about all those old projects? You can continue to schedule and use those old projects even though your player firmware has updated. Those projects will run fine. But the reverse is not true. If I build a new project in a new version of BrightAuthor, that project will not run on a player that's got old firmware. Now, we will put up warning messages inside BrightAuthor, but ultimately if you accidentally publish a project that requires newer firmware than your player has resident, the player will just simply display an error message on the screen indicating that the player firmware needs to be updated. And if you find yourself in that state, you're stuck. There's no real way to back out of that. You now are forced to update firmware on that player or reset the player and republish an older project. Firmware updates are available at the BrightSign website. You can simply download a firmware update, copy that new firmware update to the player's memory card and reboot. That will be sufficient to update firmware in a player, and it's a very easy way to accomplish the task. However, when players are remote, hard to access, spread around the world, you're publishing them via network methods, then you can specify a firmware update from inside BrightAuthor, either during player setup or when a new project or schedule is published. Both of these are very convenient ways to update a player that's at some distance. It's in a remote location. You can simply specify the firmware version at the time of publish. So let me show you how these are accomplished. Here we are at my desktop. Now what I've done to prepare is I've gone to a BrightSign player and I've taken the SD card out of it and brought that to my machine. As I open, you'll see here a number of files that the player has been using. It's my intention to copy a firmware update to this card and put it to my player. I'll go to the BrightSign website, www.brightsign.biz, go to the support link and to the software download page. Now on this page you'll find at the top our current versions of BrightAuthor, but if you scroll down a bit you will find firmware for all of our players. Here are a couple of versions for the XD, the HDs are further down, and then our legacy players, the HD 110, 210, 1010 and so forth are also here. We have not abandoned these players. In fact, you'll note that as recently as October 22nd, we updated the firmware for these players. We continue to support them fully, and you can find firmware for them here. I'm going to grab the firmware for the XD player. You'll note that in most cases we have an official release and we also have a beta release. If we've got it here on our website for download, we're confident that that version of firmware is stable. We've tested it. We may not be completely finished testing it, and so it will continue to be marked beta, but we have a very high degree of confidence that this firmware is okay. So I'm going to pull this 47106 version down to use on my XD player. When you choose download, you'll be reminded about the licensing agreement, and then your browser, however your browser works, I'm using Firefox in this case, to save that file to some location, for example to your desktop. Now I took the liberty of downloading this before we started to save the download time. Here's what was downloaded, that firmware version 4.7.106. You'll note that this is a compressed archive folder. I cannot simply use it as it is. I'm going to need to open this folder and within the archive find the actual software update. In the case of our current HD and XD players, our firmware files always specify in the name of the file the type of player and the version that this firmware targets, and our file extensions end BSFW, BrightSign firmware. So you can tell by the name of this file that this is version 47106 and it's intended for an XD player. The good news is if you accidentally put this on a card that goes to something other than an XD player, the player will simply ignore it. You're not at risk of ruining your player or accidentally putting a bad firmware on it. I'm going to take this file out of the archive and copy it to my desktop. That'll only take a moment. These files aren't huge. And now I can go to my SD card and copy that firmware update directly to the card. Notice I'm doing this without eliminating any of the project information that was already on that player. The good news again is that I can do this. Now the firmware update exists on this SD card. I can put this card back in the player. The player will reboot and immediately notice that there is firmware available on the player, so before it on the card, and so before the player tries to run the project, it will first apply that firmware update. After updating the firmware, the player will reboot itself, having deleted the firmware update off the card. So now as the player reboots with the new firmware already consumed and in place, it boots and finds no firmware update on the card. It simply finds all the project files, and the player will resume running the scheduled projects, but now with the new firmware in place. So updating firmware by putting a copy of the firmware on a card and rebooting the player is a very straightforward task. But as I said, suppose your players are elsewhere and you're not able to get to the player and its memory card. We include firmware update options on all of our publish screens. So this is our local publish screen. Here is our BrightSign network publish screen, and you'll see in this case a firmware update is available. The local network publishing via a LAN, specify a firmware update is available. The simple file networking method of publishing also includes specifying a firmware update. And during player setup, here's our familiar BrightSign player setup screen. A firmware update is available there. All of these buttons behave exactly the same. So let's imagine I'm going to publish to local storage this project. Doesn't matter how I'm publishing. If I want to include a firmware update, I specify the firmware update and I'm presented with this menu from by BrightAuthor. I can choose the version of firmware I want for any of the player models that we support. In fact, let's assume your network and the players in your network are of a variety of different types and models. Let's say you have a mix of legacy HD players, new HD players, and new XD players throughout your worldwide network. You remember I mentioned that players will ignore the firmware that they can't use and only consume firmware that they can. So the good news there is I can specify a firmware version for all of my players and say OK and publish. Notice that my specify firmware update icon or button now has a pair of asterisks by it. And when I publish this project, BrightAuthor will include those new firmware versions along with the publish. And as the published project arrives to the player, it'll arrive with firmware. The player will consume the firmware, reboot, and restart with the new firmware in place. You'll also notice that BrightAuthor knows the available versions. When BrightAuthor runs, BrightAuthor will check with BrightSign servers to find out what versions of firmware are available and present these options. You may see these numbers change over time as new versions of firmware become available. BrightAuthor will download fresh copies of this firmware when you hit publish. But what if you don't have an internet connection and BrightAuthor cannot go get those versions of firmware? Lastly, I have an option to specify a firmware update file that I might already have on my machine. I can browse to the location for that file. In fact, I've got one here on my desktop. It's the one that we downloaded earlier. There it is. I can choose a firmware file directly and incorporate that in my publish. So I have the option of allowing BrightAuthor over the internet to go get versions off our server, but I also have the option of allowing BrightAuthor to simply pull off my local drive a version of firmware that I've already downloaded. I'll choose publish. The project will be published out to the players, and the firmware will be included. So that's all there is to publishing a firmware update out to your players. You can decide the best method for you, simply copying a file to your card, or incorporating firmware with a publish, or incorporating firmware during a new player setup. That concludes this module regarding firmware updates.